Creating a video game is a complex project that often takes multiple teams and robust systems to manage properly, and even a moment's misstep can lead to unexpected consequences. Some games become victim to having small developments mysteriously lost in translation, but did you know there is a Silent Hill project which has vanished entirely? This is the story of the Silent Hill game you can never play again. The year is 2001, and Konami embraces the challenge of adapting games for newer technologies. Not only had they published Silent Hill 2 for the new generation of PlayStation consoles, but they also revisited the first title of the series and repurposed it for the Game Boy Advance. This adaptation was play novel Silent Hill, an interactive branching story in which players would relive the events of the first game as a visual novel, with additional scenes and more information of characters and events that are experienced in the original version of the game. The additional scenes of the play novel is what would pique the interest of fans who played the original Silent Hill. The reason being that play novel felt like a spin on the original story that was so legitimate, and so the additional information we could learn from it would be canon. A great example of this is when we were to explore the story of Cybil Bennett, a cop from Brahms who we meet at the beginning of Silent Hill. Her character and entire backstory isn't explored beyond her focal responsibilities in the original title, but play novel would not just explain parts of her story, it would include an entire scenario and what happened to Cybil during her time in Silent Hill that we could experience. At the heart of play novel is the desire to learn more about the world and characters who we don't see when we play as Harry in the original game. During Cybil's scenario, we meet recognisable characters such as Dahlia Gillespie, the priestess of the Order who also meets Harry at Balkan Church. We also find and meet Cheryl, Harry's lost daughter. Curiously though, Cybil also encounters a character who is never mentioned in the original Silent Hill game. This is a young boy named Andy. In her brief encounter, Cheryl and Cybil walk by the aqueduct and spot a hand reaching out of the freezing waters. Cybil grabs the hand and the player can decide which character they are pulling out. Choosing the hand that is that of a young boy will reveal that Andy is the victim in the water. He climbs out, pushes past Cybil and fights Cheryl, claiming that she pushed him in. And this brief encounter is all that we see from Andy in Cybil's story. So, who is Andy? Is he just a random child placed in this moment with no context? Well, not quite. Play novel was meant to provide more context for the original story, not to add more layers of confusion, and so Andy had a purpose. In fact, Andy had more than a purpose, he had an entire scenario dedicated to him, quite like Harry and Cybil. This scenario was simply called A Boy. The Boy was an extra scenario to Silent Hill play novel and was consequently the experiment of another new technology of the time which was being embraced, the mobile Game Boy adapter. This was a peripheral for the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Advance SP, which allows players to connect to compatible Japanese mobile phones. The peripheral was a collaboration between Nintendo and Mobile 21. To help demonstrate the real capabilities of the new peripheral, the new Silent Hill play novel would feature a downloadable exclusive scenario to those who would connect to their mobile phones. And unfortunately, this was the only way that you could access this scenario. It was only accessible via this peripheral that must remain connected, but not only this, the Boy's scenario was split into 4 segments, each reflecting seasons: spring, summer, winter and fall, and these seasons would be released throughout the year. All of these moving parts of Andy's story meant none of it was properly archived. This was made worse by the fact that the mobile data service was disconnected only 1 year after its release due to a poor reception. So what does all of this mean? Well, with no archive of the scenario and no way to really revisit the downloadable seasons, the story of Andy has essentially been lost. You might be thinking, well, why not just find a Game Boy which has this scenario already installed? Well, this downloadable scenario is actually erased once the system shuts off. So you would need to find a Game Boy that hasn't been turned off since 2001 and has this scenario already installed. With that in mind, it's probably safe to say that there really is no way for you to play this. That said, there are still remnants of a boy that we can find. We can of course find Andy in Cybil's scenario, where in one frame he's in the water and the other when he pushes Cheryl. But interestingly, we can also find Andy on the back cover of the Play novel box art. I find it really spooky that one of the only ways that you can now see Andy is in this really weird image where he almost looks trapped behind the window. But there's actually a more important side of Andy that we can also find. A few moments ago, I mentioned how this scenario was split into 4 chapters, or seasons. Well, the first chapter, simply titled Spring, was actually available to download from launch. This is important to bear in mind as we take a look at the Play novel Guidebook, in which you can find details of this chapter. This entry in the Play novel Guidebook is the most valuable insight that we have into Andy's story. In here we can see frames from the scenario itself, a flowchart of some of the decisions in the chapter, and a brief summary of who Andy is. Andy is a 7-year-old boy who lives in the house next door to Harry and Cheryl Mason. One morning, Andy goes through his usual routine of looking out his bedroom window for Cheryl. He becomes unsatisfied with just looking at her from afar and actually wants to become friends with her. The scenario begins in the backyard where Andy sees Cheryl and the player can choose to either take a deep breath or call out to her. Deciding to take a deep breath will have Andy close his eyes to regain composure, but when he reopens his eyes, he finds Cheryl has vanished. The other option sees Andy about to call out to her, but quickly interrupted by Harry, who opens the door and talks to Cheryl instead. Either option will lead Andy to continue trying to build a friendship with her. He secretly goes into Harry's car before he sets off with Cheryl, and he holds his breath to remain silent. At one point during this car ride though, the entire vehicle jerks and stops hard. Andy leaves the car and finds that Harry and Cheryl are both gone. He decides to walk around the town that they've arrived in and look for Cheryl. Then, the player can decide that he either hears footsteps behind him or the rocks that he's currently standing on crumble. Choosing to hear footsteps leads him to thinking that Cheryl is behind him, but strangely, he's unable to move. The second option finds Andy rolling to the bottom of the incline where again, he is unable to move for a while. The player will now receive the First Sight card, which is an unlockable for Play novel for completing this chapter. There are some additional bits of text and screenshots on this page about the chapter, but it's really just extra context behind the moments that I just spoke about. Something worth highlighting though is that Andy sometimes sees Alessa instead of Cheryl. For anyone unfamiliar with Silent Hill and who Alessa is, she's Cheryl's other half. That's really keeping it simple for the purpose of this video, so if you did want to learn more about her, just take a look at my other content or play the game. I figured it's worth highlighting this as there are a few instances where Andy encounters Alessa, out his bedroom window in this frame, on this playing card, and in Cybil's scenario, if the player chooses that the hand belongs to that of a young girl, she will see Alessa above the aqueduct. So there is clearly a connection between Andy and Alessa that would have been explored in this scenario, but what that is can only be a theory now. There are likely some other areas around the mobile service and Andy's scenario that I haven't picked up on in this video, but the majority of key information we do have available has now been covered. I'd love for us to find out more about the A Boy scenario, so if anyone has any connections with someone in Japan who perhaps played this when the mobile service was active, maybe ask them about it? It's definitely a long shot, but that really is the only way that we'll get more information about this story. I do have some theories myself about Andy in this scenario, but I don't really think they're strong enough to add here. That said, if you guys have some theories about this story, please do let me know. And if you're keen to learn more about this scenario, I've left some resources in the description that I suggest you check out. But for now, this was the Silent Hill game that you can never play again.